Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to World History. My name is Eric Lopez Perez, and today we are going to continue with the topic of World War II. The World War II is one of the most important historical events on human history, so big and important that gave birth and destroyed ideologies, gave shape to the geography of the time, and marked the path for oncoming events that also changed the world. It was a global war that lasted from September 1st, 1939 until September 2nd, 1945. If we talk about this event, we will have to spend a lot of time because of the abundant different stories in different fronts of the war, the different perspectives and reasons of each country in the war, and the different consequences when it was ended. However, today we are going to focus in the end of this war and some of the greatest aftermaths in geographical and political terms.
And be in readiness for the conflict, for it is better for us to perish in battle than to look upon the outrage of our nation.
First, we are going to discuss an important event that changed the course of the war, the D-Day. The D-Day was the Allied invasion of Normandy, located in France, and was executed under the codename of Operation Overlord. It took 2 years of planning, training, and supplying by the United States and Great Britain, and was one of the most heavily guarded secrets of the war. The event started on the morning of June 5, 1944, when the General Dwight Eisenhower gave the order for an armada of 3,000 landing craft, 2,500 ships, and 500 naval vessels to depart from the English ports to cross the narrow strip of sea to the German-controlled French beach of Normandy. The night of June 5th, 822 aircrafts dropped parachutes and gliders, which intended to be the vanguard of the whole operation. The next morning, at 6:30 a.m. of June 6, 1944, the Allies used the surprise effect to attack the Germans in the then codenamed Omaha Beach. The operation suffered a lot of casualties, in what is described as one of the most intense and cruel fronts of the war. This operation gave the Allies the opportunity to start marching inland to begin a face-to-face battle against the Germans and the liberation of France. This marked the beginning of the end for the war, even when it passed 11 months after the D-Day for the war to be officially ended. The D-Day, alongside with the successful Allied invasion of Western France, made the Germans gather reserved forces and launched a massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes, offensive that collapsed in January of 1945. At the same time, the Red Army of the Soviet Union, that survived intense battles such as the Battle of Stalingrad, were closing in from the east, invading Poland and East Prussia. By March, the Allies were crossing the Rhine River while capturing hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Meanwhile, the Red Army entered Austria through intense battles against the Germans, and both Allies and Soviets were now approaching Berlin. During those first months of 1945, the Germans put a fierce defense, but because of the number of troops of both Reds and regular Allies, rapidly lost territory, ran out of supplies, and exhausted its options. In April, the Allied front in Italy started to have problems. On April 6, 1945, the Reds finally arrived to Berlin, and one of the cruelest, savage, and intense battles started in the form of the Battle of the Silo Heights. The Soviets won the battle and entered into Berlin, crushing the German defenses that were there. In the River Elf on April 25, 1945, near Torgau, Germany, the Allies and Reds finally met, surrounding the last defenses of the Germans and launching a last attack to Berlin. At the same time, the Italian front, the last hope of Germany, was compromised, as Mussolini was killed by his own people and the regime was removed, so the Allies had a new entry by the south. The Germans were now surrounded in all fronts. This sealed their fate. 5 days later, on April 30th, 1945, the leader of the Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, surrounded and out of options, committed suicide to avoid punishment by the side of the Reds. The battle ended until May 2nd, 1945, when the last forces of the Germans surrendered. The General Hasso von Montefeld and Kurt von Tippelskirch surrendered to the Allies, while the commander of the Berlin defense area, Helmut Wilding, unconditionally surrendered to the General Vasily Chuikov of the Soviet Army. The Nazi Germany was defeated, and with them Europe was free again. The European front was won by the Allies, and two of the three main Axis powers were now defeated. Now, there is only one empire that seems determined to be destroyed before to surrender. The only empire between war and peace was Japan. The last front of the war was the Pacific. The Allies, Americans, and the Philippine Commonwealth advanced in order to take and clear the Philippines by the end of April 1945. The front of the Pacific had intense battles in Asian territory, specifically China. The Chinese front and forces were important for the defeat of the Japanese Empire. During the first months of 1945, the war was very personal for Japan. During the nights of the 9th and 10th of March, the Americans threw thousands of incendiary bombs over Tokyo, killing 100,000 civilians. Over the next 5 months, the fire bombings were continuous, reaching a total of 67 Japanese cities damaged and killing near 400,000 civilians by burning 65% of the build-up areas. In May 1945, the Allies, Australia, Great Britain, China, and the United States won the Battle of Burma against the Japanese, and during April 6th and 7th of the same month, the Chinese won the Battle of West Hunan, freeing China of Japan. Meanwhile, the Americans' naval and amphibious forces invaded Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and their submarines cut off Japanese imports. This reduced Japan's ability to supply its overseas forces. After the German surrender, the Allies sent a message that asked for unconditional Japanese surrender or total destruction, but the Japanese government rejected it. The Americans then mobilized the last phases of the Manhattan Project. The project where scientists like Albert Einstein, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Leona Woods, among others, developed the nuclear bombs capable to wipe out an entire city. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., the first atomic bomb was dropped over Hiroshima, Japan. The entire city was destroyed. Then, President Truman of the United States did a broadcast announcement about the use of the weapon and promising that if Japan does not surrender, Then, more of these catastrophes would be repeated until there was nothing of Japan. However, the Japanese government refused to believe that the Americans had a supply of atomic bombs, so they rejected the purpose of peace. On August 9, 1945, the Soviets invaded the Japanese-conquered zone of Manchuria in China in order to put more pressure over Japan to surrender. And then, at 11 a.m., the second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki and killed 80,000 people. The incursion of the Soviets into other conquered lands and islands, along with the fear of a third atomic bomb and a total Soviet invasion, made Japanese troops surrender on August 15, 1945. And the final documents being signed at Tokyo Bay on the deck of the American battleship USS Missouri on September 2, 1945.
The war was over.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue.
After 6 years of intense war through Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, the Axis powers were finally defeated, and the Allies won the war, and peace was now a possibility. The United States and the Soviet Union proved their bravery and power, something that brought the war to an end, but would make both nations fight and put in doubt the peace of the world once more, alongside with the loyalty of the nations. At the end of World War II, there were a lot of consequences. The new superpowers were those who won, but now the spotlight was for the United States and the Soviet Union.
In Japan, the social reforms urged by MacArthur proved one of the most successful experiments in history.
The United States led the Allies to the occupation and rehabilitation of Japan, that enacted widespread military, political, economic, and social reforms.
Became a friend.
The relationship had a good beginning, by allowing Hirohito to still being the emperor under a new constitution.
The occupation, the people took him to their hearts. His family.
Germany, however, had a bad ending by being divided into two. East Germany, that was a satellite state of the Soviet Union, and West Germany, occupied by the Allies. The Soviet Union started to put left-wing governments in the countries that the Red Army liberated during the war. This made the United States and Great Britain fear about the permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the creation of Soviet-influenced communist parties coming to power to the democracies of Western Europe, something that the United States was determined to stop. Meanwhile, the Soviets were determined to spread communism worldwide. These different ideologies started an ideological fight without physical intervention, based on threats, politics, economics, and propaganda. They were trying to prove which ideology was the best by different races, like armament or space races, but always keeping the intention of a nuclear war. The conflict, the Cold War, started in 1947. The bipolarity of the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union in terms of international relations can be explained as the influence each ideology or nation had in different parts of the world. First of all, the ideologies divided Europe, with many countries adopting the communist idea by force, or others staying with the democracy as the main political idea. These events extended in Asia, with countries like China, Vietnam, and Korea, which the last two caused inner wars to establish the communist idea. This caused new American interventions that cost the lives of civilians and soldiers. In America, however, Cuba adopted the communist idea and threatened the USA interest, causing the missile crisis in 1962. Other events in America, like the movements made by the students in Mexico, heads of state in countries like Chile, ideological movements and propaganda, made the presidents or dictators of those countries thought that the menace of communism was imminent, and at the same time, this is proof of the ideological control of capitalism and democracy. During this period of time, the world was divided by two ideologies and two great superpowers, a division that fell at the end of the 1980s, with events like the agreement of Japan, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the acceptance of ideologies in Latin America, and the economic disaster of the Soviet Union.
The chief state TV channel was halfway through its evening news when it got the first details of the agreement signed in Minsk. Quoting from it, the anchorwoman announced, "The Soviet Union, as a subject of international and geopolitical reality, no longer exists."
However, the ideals of capitalism and communism are still not clear, or, for us people of my age, we don't understand how it was to live in a world that was developed with these ideals in a higher level. For that, I am going to interview people that actually lived this period of the Cold War. It's important to say that the people that I am going to interview does not have a good level of English.
Le vengo a hacer unas preguntas acerca del periodo de la Guerra Fría. Para empezar, quisiera comenzar con su explicación. ¿En qué consistía la Guerra Fría?
La Guerra Fría básicamente nació después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, cuando los países empezaron a repartirse, los países poderosos empezaron a repartirse los países débiles. Entonces ahí es donde empezó que tenía más fuerza tener más derecho a tener más países controlados, dominados y imponerles su ideología, básicamente.
Por países poderosos nos referimos a Estados Unidos y la Unión Soviética.
Exactamente.
Estamos de acuerdo que sus ideologías eran bastante fuertes en el mundo por ese entonces.
Sí, dominaron mucho. Estados Unidos domina América Latina, parte de Europa y África. Y la Unión Soviética o la URSS domina lo que es la parte de las Coreas que se dividió, parte de Asia, y el bloque socialista, donde incluía Polonia, lo que antes era Checoslovaquia, Bulgaria, los países básicamente son los que tenía bajo control, y la mitad de Alemania.
Sí, pero esos ideales, ¿cómo afectaron a México?
Pues económicamente no afectaron, afectaron los movimientos, pero son que se empezaron bien, pero después se desviaron, ya empezaron con otro tipo de enfoque y fue mal visto.
Como los movimientos estudiantiles.
Los movimientos estudiantiles, empezó todo por una pelea entre el POL y la UNAM, vocacionales, y terminó la policía y ahí generó el movimiento y fue creciendo como bola de nieve. Entonces el gobierno ya no tuvo control en eso y por eso mandó a reprimir. Pero había cosas interesantes en ese movimiento, pero desafortunadamente fueron apagadas por el gobierno.
Muchos tachaban, o he leído que muchos tachaban de comunistas a los estudiantes. ¿Cómo se veía el comunismo en México?
Se veía malo, se veía como si fuera el diablo. La iglesia y el gobierno tenían esa presión hacia la población de inculcar que el comunismo era malo y que si tú eres comunista o nos convertíamos en comunistas nos íbamos a ir al infierno, básicamente. Pero pues, la gente que no sabe leer, es ignorante, pues se dejó llevar por esas cosas. Y algunos líderes pues, se aprovecharon de eso para obtener mejores puestos. No lucharon por una convicción, sino por intereses personales.
¿Afectó su vida de alguna forma este movimiento?
A mí no, a uno sí les afectó. Había gente con ideal que fue reprimida, encarcelada, algunos fueron hasta asesinados y otros se aprovecharon de esa ideología para escalar puestos políticos. Y hoy en día pues, tienen buenos puestos políticos y viven bien, es cual comunismo.
Eso es la otra cara de la moneda, el capitalismo. ¿Cómo definiría usted el capitalismo y sus efectos en el país?
Básicamente, bueno, pues es el crecimiento de empresas poderosas que vienen a realizar explotación, a obtener sus propios beneficios, a agotar los recursos naturales, a agotar al máximo el trabajador, y el que está en contubernio pues es el propio gobierno, que les permite el hacer y deshacer de lo que quiera con la clase trabajadora y con el país. Y ellos son los que tienen el control en sí del país, ellos deciden qué se hace y qué no se hace.
Podríamos decir que el capitalismo es un sistema político y económico donde las empresas tienen el poder para su beneficio propio.
Exacto, sí, porque la población no tiene ningún beneficio, o sea, trabaja más de 8 horas con salarios miserables, y los que se enriquecen más son ellos, ¿no? Entonces, básicamente, pues ellos tienen el control y hacen el teje y maneje de las cosas, ¿no? Donde la clase obrera pues está más empobrecida que otra cosa, más explotada por las mismas circunstancias que se da, y el gobierno pues no le interesan esas cosas. Ellos reciben así como se dice vulgarmente, su tajada para su propio beneficio, y dejan que las empresas poderosas y empresas grandes hagan y deshagan lo que ellos quieren.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por su tiempo.
Gracias, hasta luego.
Buenas tardes.
Hasta luego.
Buenas tardes.
Me gustaría hacer unas preguntas sobre el periodo de la Guerra Fría. Para empezar, ¿en qué consistía la Guerra Fría?
La Guerra Fría consistía sobre todo en el antagonismo que existía entre el capitalismo y el socialismo, que no comunismo, porque el comunismo es una utopía que no realmente nunca llegó a existir, pero sí el socialismo antagónico con el capitalismo, estas dos grandes potencias entre Estados Unidos y la desaparecida Unión Soviética, que traían ahí una situación geopolítica de intereses globales que tenían que representar fuerza para cada uno de los bloques. Entonces, pues básicamente yo entiendo la Guerra Fría como ese punto en el que sin necesidad de armas, sino con el hecho de posiciones políticas, pues se sentía una tensión mundial.
¿Y cómo afectó todo este movimiento a México?
Realmente a México en los años 60 de la Guerra Fría se sentía, no porque lo haya vivido, sino más bien por noticias recibidas de esos momentos, un rechazo generalizado hacia el pensamiento socialista, porque se pensaba que era una situación en la que molestaba los intereses de ciertos sectores, y entonces la gente común pensaba que el pensamiento socialista era negativo.
¿Afectó de alguna forma el comunismo en su vida? Porque tengo entendido que durante las épocas de los movimientos estudiantiles o golpes de Estado, se consideraba al comunismo como el culpable. Entonces, ¿de alguna forma esta ideología afectó su vida?
No tanto que haya afectado, porque realmente en México nunca hubo una afectación por las ideas socialistas, sino más bien sí una influencia en el modo de pensar pues en los 80s, por ejemplo, cuando ya la situación socialista ya no era tan fuerte, pues ya una situación un poco menos tensa, pero sí influía mucho en el pensamiento de la gente, ¿no? En lo personal, la ideología socialista sí me llamó mucho la atención, sí me impactó, sí la sentía como una ideología muy apegada al ser humano, pero después al contemplar una utopía en cuanto al comunismo, pues ya la situación política de los países pues cambia, y la ideología también tiene que adecuarse a los tiempos modernos.
Un buen punto que me gustaría señalar es que mencionó que el comunismo es como tal una utopía, porque tenemos entendido o definimos comunismo como una sociedad en donde no hay clases, la propiedad privada no existe y todo es equitativo. Y aún así esto no fue bien aplicado en los países supuestamente comunistas.
Exactamente, nunca se llegó a tener un país realmente que aplicara la ideología comunista como tal, como lo define Marx en su libro, El Capital, y realmente por eso es que nunca se llegó a tener realmente un país que aplicara la ideología comunista. Entonces de ahí el término de la utopía, ¿no? Sin embargo, el socialismo como tal, pues sí llegó a aplicarse. Aún en estos días hay países que llevan la ideología socialista y bueno, hasta la fecha todavía tenemos ese lineamiento político.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por su tiempo.
This was the story of the last half of the 20th century, the end of the World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, a time where wars were present all the time and gave shape to the ideals, to the nations and people that now we know. This period is extremely important for the history of the world. It is considered by the author as one of the most interesting parts of human history. A war that each side of it told us a different story, different reasons, different perspectives. A war that showed us that in an event like this, there is no good or bad side, but different perspectives. The Nazi methods and some ideals were extremely wrong, but the idea of break the Treaty of Versailles was good. The fact of break a treaty that was killing a nation and its people and made a new nation based on pride, honor, and glory was not that bad. But the execution, there was the problem. The period of rivalry between communism and capitalism/democracy was a problem that indirectly brought different wars, militias, heats of states, and revolutions in different countries. Some of them damaged the countries and others failed, leading to uncertainty. This part of history brought a lot of changes that even today are topic for debate. But there is no doubt that brought a lot of lessons that we, as humanity, must learn and understand in order to avoid fall in the same mistakes. Today, we think that those times were wrong and the war was stupid. Their motivations were stupid, and we are not capable of such destruction nowadays. However, if we look at our world, we can see that new extremist ideals are taking countries. Such things that today must be unthinkable as racism are rising again. Even the ideals of the neo-Nazis are rising too. Conflicts between nations over lands, resources, or different ideals are news of every day.
We never understood the lessons. Or perhaps we forgot them. The fact is that a new conflict of such proportions as the World War II, it's a possibility. It's just a matter of time. This was World History. My name is Eric Lopez, and thank you for your time.
Gathered in their masses, just like like witches at black masses, evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh Lord, yeah.